Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Bay of Pigs invasion was successful. The Bay of Pigs invasion happened on April 17, 1961. Not US citizens went to Cuba, but around 1,200 Cubans got arms from the Americans and were sent with the support of the US to Cuba. Cuba became communist, but not everyone was happy with it, and the US considered Cuba as part of its backyard. Thus, having communists rule over Cuba was unacceptable, especially during the height of the Cold War. The US decided to send Cubans instead of US citizens because these Cubans, they were opposed to the rule of Castro. Moreover, the US didn't want to necessarily invade Cuba on their own with their own soldiers for very understandable reasons. Once the international community found out about it, President Kennedy stopped every kind of air support. This meant that the Cuban revolutionary forces, they were able to win, and Fidel Castro personally led the counter-offensive. The result of it was that Castro became a national hero, the communists, they defended Cuban soil, and they also solidified their rule over Cuba. The US experienced thus a huge failure in their foreign policy, and it also pushed Cuba more towards the Soviet camp, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Until today, Cuba remains under communist rule despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and despite the sanctions that have been decided against Cuba. But what if all of that changed? What if the Bay of Pigs invasion was successful? Let's just say that in this timeline, the US would perfectly justify, for that time, their support for the Bay of Pigs invasion. American businesses, they have been nationalized, and the US could twist it or turn it around saying that they will support their citizens that are right now in danger. Another thing that could happen as well would be that the US involvement would not have been discovered by the international community, or the US could just continue to support the Cuban fighters with supply, air support, and so on. Now, would the Cuban exiles immediately win? No, of course not. The Cuban exiles would probably have the element of surprise on their sides, but they would not be able to single-handedly take over Cuba and change the government. The US would then need to send some more soldiers or Cuban exiles on certain key locations, but they would be able to do so, and over time they would be able to win and slowly take over Cuba. Castro and many communist leaders, they would probably die in battle, and the highest ranking leaders that survived, they would be put into trial. It's very possible that they could have been judged in the US and be put on the death penalty. The US would immediately win back their influence in Cuba, especially in the economy. Cuba would have been a bit destroyed, and it's possible that the US would give some credit to Cuba to rebuild. There are now a few problems that would happen. The first problem would be that most Cubans would not really support the US. The US would not be blind, and they would know that this would be a ticking time bomb. And if this revolution failed this time, another revolution could happen at any other time, and it may actually succeed. The second problem Cuba could face would be the devastation from the invasion. The third problem would be that investments in Cuba would probably not come overnight, and the trust in Cuba and its economy would also be very low for the moment. And the last problem we would also have for Cuba is who would rule Cuba instead of Castro or Batista. What's up, guys? Sorry for the little interruption, but I'm sure you have noticed that on my channel I have many videos that are scheduled for like 1 week, 2 weeks, or even 3 weeks. If you are really impatient, if you can really not hold yourself And if you really must see these videos, please subscribe on my Patreon. There are various options which you can take. I'm sure you will find the most adequate option for yourself. And also please go down, check the links below for my Facebook page and also for my TikTok as well as for my Twitter account. And now let's go back to the alternate history video. Cuba would thus never totally stabilize over time, and Cuba would always be very much observed by the US. The US may still grow somewhat paranoid but also proactive. The interventions throughout Latin America, they would grow even more in this timeline because the US would have been motivated by the victory in the Bay of Pigs. This means that in the short term the US influence would be bigger in Latin America, and places like Nicaragua may actually never have turned towards the Sandinistas, for instance, or communists or socialists. But in the long term, Latinos, they would despise the US even more than in our timeline, and it could lead to several side effects which I can't totally predict. Maybe at some point we may see a complete US-Latino split, or some countries, without turning to the extreme left, they would then try to reposition themselves. What would happen with Vietnam? I think that in this timeline the US would have a higher morale boost, and since there was no failure in Cuba, the American public would support the Vietnam War a bit longer than in OTL. Long enough for the US to overthrow the communists in the north and to establish a democratic Vietnam. Vietnam could have chances to become a very developed economy, similar to South Korea in OTL, but Cuba would not have a chance to get as advanced as Vietnam. With Castro out of the picture, the Cuban Missile Crisis would then not happen, which would ironically give enough time to Khrushchev and even some more years for him to rule over the USSR. He would then not be seen as a weak leader internationally for backing away from Cuba, because he would never even have a chance to do that at all. The USSR, they may actually be in a better spot in this timeline and survive some more years, or perhaps even stay intact if they get really lucky in here. With Cuba and Vietnam being taken by the US, I think that two things could happen. Either the US would lose somewhere at some point, and it would end up with some backlash or strong response, or the Sino-Soviet split could have been reversed, partially at least. If Khrushchev lived long enough, and Mao may be gone earlier, it would butterfly away so many things that the Soviets and the Chinese could come close to each other again. In the short term the US would win, but long term they could alienate much more of Latin America and perhaps suffer from a bigger failure after winning in Cuba and Vietnam, while the Soviets could be in a better spot, and chances for a reversal of the Sino-Soviet split would increase as well. The Cold War would probably continue for a bit longer. The US would still have the odds at their side, but the USSR would have better chances in this time around to beat the Americans. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.